The sea and the winds that whip it up into waves are constantly ripping the shores of the British Isles apart, moving the materials elsewhere, and building new land. They are a titanic force for change. Look at the North Devon coast, where I'm standing. The cliffs have been worn back so far that streams are left hanging in mid-air. The water tumbles 70 feet to the beach. The rock platform washed by the waves is the base of the old cliffs. We're a group of small islands on the edge of an enormous expanse of water. The wind builds up ocean waves which gather momentum over thousands of miles. All that colossal power is thrown at the land. There's a prodigious expenditure of raw energy, and there's equally implacable resistance to it, all in the small area where the air, the water, and the land meet. In the British Isles, we have over 10,000 miles of extraordinarily varied and attractive coastline. And that's because we're on the edge of things. In two senses. This part of the Earth's surface has spent most of its life on the edge of one of the plates that form the Earth's crust. And that's why it's made up of such a bewildering variety of contrasting materials. And we're at an edge where a continent meets an ocean, and vast quantities of energy are expended as one fights against the other. From Loch Moidart on the northwest coast of Scotland to Beachy Head and the Seven Sisters in Sussex, and from the Blackwater estuary in Essex to the cliffs of Moher in County Clare. All these coastal features have been shaped by the battle between the materials they consist of and the waves that beat on them. There's quite a number of landscape features that are the creation of the wind alone. Braunton Burrows in North Devon was a constantly changing belt of sand dunes until the plant life won the battle to keep them in one place. More dunes in the Suffolk Breckland, but these are 50 miles from the sea. Sand was dumped by melting ice at the end of a cold phase. Then, tens of thousands of years later, the temperature dropped again. Dry, cold winds whipped the sand up into a miniature desert. The dark strip in these cliffs on the Kent coast is called loess. It's the dust blown up by Ice Age winds. A band of loess stretches from here halfway across Europe. We still have our dust storms today. This is the fenland of East Anglia. And if the wind alone can have that kind of effect on the landscape, just think what it can do with the added assistance of huge volumes of water. This is the Chesil Beach in Dorset. It's the largest continuous shingle ridge of its kind in Britain or Ireland. It's 18 miles long, it weighs something between 50 and 100 million tons, and it's joined to the land behind for only about a third of its length. And it's entirely the creation of the wind and the waves. Dr. Rita Gardner lectures in geography at King's College London. It is an extraordinary beach. How did it get here?
The story starts between
Yes.
about 70 and 18,000 years ago. We were in the last glacial then, Arctic conditions in this part of the world. The most important thing was that the sea level was up to 100 metres lower than present. So you have to imagine that the shoreline is way out there. So what we would have here is no Chesil Beach at all, and this would be land. Rivers would be bringing in their loads of pebbles and dumping them across this land surface. That would be pebbles of flint coming out of the chalk, pebbles of chert coming out of the sandstones, and most of this ridge is made up of those pebbles of flint and chert. But pebbles having been dumped out there, how did they then get into the shape of the ridge? Here we have to start thinking about sea level rising. Started to rise 15,000 years ago, rose at a rate of about 1 to 1.5 metres every 100 years. By 10,000 years ago, it was 45 metres below present, so it was still some distance out there. But as the sea level rose, particularly under the influence also of strong winds coming from the southwest, it was able to comb up and sort out the pebbles from the material that had been dumped out in the bay. And so a ridge of pebbles started to develop in the bay and was moved on shore. And the way it moved is by strong storm conditions, waves coming over the ridge, overtopping it, and transporting pebbles from the seaward face on to the landward face. So the whole ridge rolled towards us in this position here. And then it got to the point where it beached, and it beached up there against Portland Bill, and it beached down there between West Bay and Abbotsbury. But the bit in between didn't quite get onto the land area behind, and we have a small lagoon formed between this ridge and the land area behind it. This ridge is particularly interesting in the context of Britain and Ireland. The reason is that it's grown as a bar that has been pushed on shore. Almost all of the other shingle and sand features that protrude from the coast have formed by material growing outwards from the shore. So if you think about, for example, Scolt Head Island, that material, or the island there, has grown sideways by material being moved along the shore, longshore drift. And the way we know that is because the old ends of the ridge, as it grew sideways, were curved, recurved. And so you can see these recurved bits in Scolt Head, whereas here, if you look along it, it's absolutely straight. There are no recurved bits at all. And that's why we think it rolled on shore as a bar rather than growing outwards, sideways, from the coast.
One of the things that fascinates me about this beach is the way that the pebbles are graded from one end to the other. Why is nature so tidy-minded?
Yes, it's a fascinating point. This one comes from the western end, I think near West Bay, and this one, much larger one, is from this end near Chesilton. And there's a grading along the ridge between these two. You may be surprised, but despite between 100 and 150 years of work on Chesil Beach, we're still not sure why this grading takes place. There are two main sets of ideas. The first one was suggested back in 1853, and it's one that still receives a lot of support amongst scientists today. That suggests that the grading is a longshore, it's associated with longshore movement of pebbles along the beach. So strong winds coming across the Atlantic, they can whip up waves over huge distances. These waves hit Chesil Beach obliquely, and that hitting it obliquely sets up a longshore current which moves from the West Bay end eastwards up until Chesilton end. And we also have winds that come from the south and the southeast. There's not a great expanse of sea out in that direction, and the winds are weaker anyway. So the currents that are set up when the waves hit Chesil are weaker. Those currents are only capable of transporting smaller pebbles and they back in a westerly direction. So we have everything being moved towards the east and the small ones being moved back towards the west. That's one explanation for the sorting that you see on the beach. The alternative explanation is one that concerns different wave energy at different points along the beach. It's been shown that the height of the waves varies from lower to higher in this direction. That the periodicity, the frequency of the waves also varies, and that the angle of approach of the waves varies, so that they are quite oblique at that direction and they are less oblique up towards this end of Chesil. All of those factors means that we have lower wave energy hitting that end and higher wave energy as you move towards this end. One of the reasons why the wave energy there is low is that the area receives some shelter from the southwest peninsula. So, low wave energy is only capable of moving the smaller pebbles, and so at that point the smaller pebbles tend to be formed into the ridge, and if there are any bigger pebbles they will tend to be buried beneath the smaller ones. Towards this end, higher wave energy capable of moving bigger pebbles, and the poor small pebbles get drawn back out to sea by the process, so you get the big ones left upon the beach. But that's only an idea, and our real problem is trying to work out whether both of those forces are acting together, the longshore movement and the differences in wave energy, which is probably true, and to what extent which one is dominant at different times. And really, the grading on Chesil is yet another landscape problem. It's a problem that here is particularly important because Chesil is a natural barrier to Chesilton and the whole man-made sort of environment behind it. We need to understand what is happening on Chesil, and part of it is the grading of these pebbles.
Like the other forces that shape our landscape, the wind and the waves perform three functions. They break up the fabric of the land, they move the debris elsewhere, and they rebuild it in different forms. Many of our most striking coastal features result from the presence of relatively resistant rock side by side with more easily eroded materials. Lulworth Cove in Dorset is a good example. The strip of Portland stone nearest the sea was originally breached by a river valley. The sea was much lower then, but it rose as the ice melted and enlarged the gap. It cut through the Purbeck stone behind and then through a band of weak sand and clay. It's still eating its way into the chalk cliffs at the back of the cove. Carrick-a-Reed is a big stack off the North Antrim coast. Again, it's there because stronger and weaker rocks appear side by side. Perhaps the best-known stacks of all are the Needles, carved by the sea from the chalk of the Isle of Wight. Different degrees of resistance in the rock cause natural arches too, like Durdle Door in Dorset. The Devil's Cauldron off the south coast of Pembrokeshire isn't just an arch, it's a blowhole as well. Limestone and chalk are soluble in water, and this makes them easier for the sea to attack. The waves undercut the cliffs of Beachy Head and the Seven Sisters in Sussex until eventually the face collapses. Parts of the Seven Sisters retreat as much as 4 feet in an average year. The sea doesn't just destroy the land, though. It builds new land, too. Scolthead Island, off the North Norfolk coast, started with shingle dredged up from offshore by the waves. It grew as a series of shingle spits extending slowly further along the coast, leaving a creek between the spits and the land. And it's still growing. As the spits became more stable, they started trapping sand blown by the wind. As time went on, the dunes and shingle were colonized by plants which helped to keep them in one place. In the shelter of the creek, the plants trapped mud left by the tides. The mud accumulated, and the height of the marsh grew. More and different plants were able to establish themselves, and little freshwater streams began to develop. We've done nothing to help or hinder the growth of Scolthead Island. Plants like the edible samphire, sea pink, sea lavender, sea purslane, and the sea rush have all come here without our help. It's an entirely natural environment. It's been created in only the last 6,000 years, and it still goes on growing without any human interference. When we do intervene in the massive processes of interaction between the land and the sea, we're tampering with a powerful, complex, but delicate mechanism, and we should be wary of the consequences. There's an object lesson just along the coast from here. At the western end of the Chesil Beach at West Bay, this jetty was built in 1790. In 1830, its sides were filled in to stop the shingle drifting through. This is how the shoreline looked 30 years later. The edge of the shingle beach still ran in a more or less straight line either side of the jetty. By 1900, the sediment was building up on this side of the jetty as the longshore drift was blocked. The beach was being starved of shingle on the far side. By now, the cliffs beyond the town had little protection. By 1976, when this photograph was taken, the far beach had been reduced to a thin strip and the cliff had begun to fall away. A seawall was built, but even that has since been damaged by winter storms. After that experience, it's hardly surprising that Dorset County Council is very worried about the effects of contractors mining shingle from the coves along the coast. Shingle was dredged in huge quantities from a bank off these cliffs in South Devon at the turn of the century to build Devonport Dockyard. Without the bank to dissipate their energy, the waves quickly attacked the cliffs, and they retreated 20 feet in 50 years. The fishing village of Hall Sands was reduced to ruins. Attempting to interfere in natural processes can be a risky business. Engineers are trying it here on the Chesil Beach. Now, in the long term, they may or may not succeed in stabilizing and building up this shingle bank. But our knowledge of how these processes work is far from complete. And if they do succeed in protecting this area, then that could have a knock-on effect further along the coast. In attempting to impose our will on massive forces like those that built the Chesil Beach, we run the risk of storing up even greater problems for ourselves. The landscape of the British Isles. Some of the most varied and beautiful scenery of any area of comparable size on the surface of the earth. The creation of a complex and sensitive mechanism fueled by the energy of the sun in a never-ending process of change. Breaking up the fabric of the land, transporting it, and reconstructing it in other places and in different forms. In 1979, a storm breached the Chesil Beach in Dorset, flooding the village behind. Now, engineers have stabilized the shingle, though in doing so, they have taken the risk of intervening in the enormously powerful natural processes that have built this huge shingle bank. As much as the forces of nature, we, human beings, are a factor in the shaping of our landscape. When we interfere in its delicate mechanism, we should be wary of the consequences. "4,000 years ago, our Neolithic ancestors used antler picks to mine flints here in Suffolk. Since then, hardly a square foot of the landscape of Britain and Ireland has escaped the attentions of the human race. Like the ice, snow and frost, the rain and the rivers, the wind and the waves and the force of gravity, the human race affects the landscape in three ways. We break it up, we transport the fabric elsewhere, and we rebuild it in different forms. In terms of the Earth's history, we've made our mark in a very short time. Imagine that the Earth is only 100 years old. On that timescale, our first primitive ancestors appeared about 3.5 days ago. The fully developed human being, Homo sapiens, emerged less than 7 hours ago. The last rise in sea level, the one that built the Chesil Beach, started under 3 hours ago. And it's still going on. We first made our mark on the trees. The last invasion by the polar ice passed its peak about 18,000 years ago. As the ice and tundra retreated north, the land became blanketed with a thick forest cover, first pines and later broadleaf trees. There's little or no direct inheritance of that primeval forest left. But Wismar's Wood, on Dartmoor, gives us some idea of what the landscape around here must once have been like. Our first major impact on the landscape was in clearing the forest, by fire and by axe. And we were remarkably efficient. Heaths, like this in the New Forest, were one result of our tree felling. We slashed and we burned. Our herds overgrazed the cleared land, and then we moved on. The abandoned land was gradually colonized by heather and gorse. Our ancestors' slash and burn clearances created the Dorset heaths that Thomas Hardy so loved. But nothing stands still. Less than a century after he was writing, he wouldn't recognize them. Forestry plantations and modern farming methods have transformed the landscape yet again. Clearing the primeval forest was only the start of our impact on the landscape. We've changed it on the coast and inland. In the uplands and the lowlands, we've changed it by our own direct impact, and we've changed it by triggering natural forces. Sometimes what we've done has been deliberate, sometimes it's been accidental. David Jones, reader in geography at the London School of Economics, is with me here near the River Arun in Sussex. All this area on the edge of the Weald was thickly forested 5,000 years ago, and we've cut down vast tracts of that forest. Now, clearly that had an effect on the view, but did it have an effect on the shape of the ground?
Quite a surprising amount, actually, in this part of England, because our ancestors, chopping down trees and burning the forests up in the centre of the Weald, released quite a lot of sediment, which in fact found its way down the river valleys, and it's here, in the river valleys of the southern Weald. Trees provide a buffer or barrier between the ground surface and the falling rain. So the initial shock, if you like, of falling rain is removed by the umbrella effects of the tree canopy. Now, the water that actually finds its way through the tree cover to the ground surface then comes upon quite a thick layer of forest mulch, old leaves, bits of wood, etc., which acts as a sponge, so that takes off some more of the incoming rainfall. And when the falling water gets to the base of the mulch, it finds the soil. Now, the soil underneath a woodland area is rather different to the soil underneath a field, in that all the root systems of the trees and the shrubs provide passageways for the water to move down into the soil. And also you tend to have a much richer population of organisms, worms and things like that, underneath the forest, which also provide passageways for percolating water. So the water moves downwards into the soil rather than over the ground surface, sinks into the soil, may even go deeper down into the groundwater, where a lot of it is actually pulled back to the surface by the trees and transpired into space or into the air. Their roots also bind the ground surface, but it's essentially the canopy which is the most important sheltering effect.
So, if we cut the trees down?
You remove the interception factor, all right? 40% is intercepted under a forest. None is intercepted on this field. In agricultural areas, the potential for the water to move downwards into the soil is diminished, largely because of the use of machinery, so that in fact there will be more water arriving at the ground surface and staying at the ground surface, and that of course will then flow over the ground surface and remove soil with it. And in this situation here at Amberley, we've actually got a belt of alluvium which is about a mile wide and something like 50 feet thick at its thickest point. And the rock trough which that sediment sits in was carved by the River Arun about 9,000 to 9,500 years ago, we think, and it has been completely filled in over the last 9,500 years. Most of it, in fact, prior to 5,000 years ago, as waves of sediment came down the River Arun, were laid down in sheets in the valley bottom, the river just sort of rising up as it just couldn't cope with the load. And that these waves of sediment, we think, must have been due to forest clearance through slash and burn by very small numbers of our early ancestors, who actually had quite dramatic effects on the landscape at that time. And they created, although quite inadvertently, such extremely pleasant wetlands as this one at Amberley Wildbooks, which I think is one of the nicest wetlands in southeastern England.
David Jones was talking about how human actions can trigger natural forces. Here it was the rain and the rivers, and how they then changed the landscape. But we're a force for change in our own right, too. This is a good example. British Rail takes ballast for its tracks from this quarry in Somerset. They're breaking down the fabric, they're transporting it, and they're depositing it somewhere else in a different form. Our Bronze Age ancestors did the same. They floated huge stones from South Wales up the Bristol Channel Then they rolled them on logs all the way to Salisbury Plain to build the inner circle of Stonehenge. They dug ditches and built ramparts lined with sarsen stones not far away at Avebury. Nobody knows why they built the neighbouring Silbury Hill. It's 130 feet high, and it's the largest artificial construction of its kind in Europe. In modern times, we have destroyed whole landscapes in the search for coal. In the Middle Ages, we did the same thing for peat. Peat from Norfolk was the main source of energy for a very large area of England. The Norfolk Broads are the flooded diggings. We've always tried to improve the technology. The Stag Fort in Kerry was built by Celtic warriors 3 centuries before Christ. It's all dry stone walling. Stonemasonry and mortar were still unknown. It was the Romans who introduced stonemasonry into Britain. Hadrian's Wall stands on the natural dolerite rampart of the Windsill. And the Romans knew that if the raw materials don't suit our needs as we find them, we can change them. The Romans made bricks and tiles by baking clay. But we went on daubing untreated clay onto wattle for another 1,000 years. Cardinal Wolsey was right up with the times when he used brick for his palace at Hampton Court. The Industrial Revolution increased our impact on the landscape enormously. We cut this great gash in the South Downs to bring the railway to Shoreham. And our capacity to change the landscape has gone on growing. The architects of Maiden Castle in Dorset were at the sharp end of Bronze Age building technology. What would they have made of modern industrial wastelands like this at the mouth of the River Tees? From the earliest times, we've turned the local fabric to good use as building stone. The Burren in County Clare is all limestone, and the builders of this dolmen didn't have to go far to find the materials to build it. It's hard to imagine an old farmhouse in West Cornwall not built of granite. In Yorkshire, the local building stone is millstone grit. Could a Victorian town hall in this part of the world be built of anything else? But as well as using the local stone, we have always been ready to go to enormous lengths to get the best building material from wherever it has naturally developed to wherever we want to use it. The builders of Stonehenge set a pattern which still continues. Near Llanberis, a whole mountainside of Welsh slate has gone to make roofs all over the country and beyond. The Normans shipped limestone across the Channel from Caen to build Canterbury Cathedral. Perhaps they didn't know that we have some very fine limestones of our own. This is Tainton in Oxfordshire. Our native building in stone reached its high point in the 17th and 18th centuries, and two types of limestone were the building blocks. This oolitic limestone from the Cotswolds was one. The other was Portland stone. King James I of England commissioned his Surveyor General, Inigo Jones, to survey the Isle of Portland. Before very long, barges were carrying the shelly limestone from these quarries to London. Christopher Wren succeeded Inigo Jones under Charles II and William and Mary. He turned to the Portland stone quarries when London had to be rebuilt after the Great Fire. Rennie's Waterloo Bridge opened in 1817. It was built of granite from Devon and Aberdeen. But when the London County Council rebuilt it in 1944, the choice, yet again, was Portland stone. As we break the fabric down, move it around, and rebuild it, what we achieve isn't always what we intend. Without meaning to, we can trigger great change, immediately or later, in the same place or somewhere else. At Bournemouth, we built these groins to stop the beach moving along the shore with the waves. "10 miles further on, at Barton-on-Sea, the bathing beach was once as good as Bournemouth's. Now it's disappeared. No one bathes here anymore." But beaches aren't just for bathing. They're the land's best protection against the destructive power of the sea. Perron Beach in Cornwall disperses all the energy of the Atlantic rollers in a few yards. If we starve the beach, as we did at Barton, the waves soon start eating away at the cliffs behind. Beach feeding is one solution. It was tried at Barton. But carting colossal quantities of sand and shingle and dumping it on the shore is laborious and expensive. So perhaps the answer is a sea wall protecting the foot of the cliffs. But it's not as simple as that. The trouble is that a sea wall isn't nearly as good as a beach at absorbing the energy of the waves. In fact, it absorbs very little, and most of the wave power is simply reflected. The waves scour away any remaining beach, and eventually they get under the sea wall and around its ends and destroy it. The only complete solution to Barton's problems would be to dismantle the groins at Bournemouth. These enormous man-made defences near Folkestone in Kent won't last as long as a good natural beach. Many of our interventions in the sensitive workings of the landscape may have unfortunate or at least unforeseen consequences, but some are certainly beneficial. The fens in East Anglia are among our most fertile farming country. They are an entirely man-made landscape. The Thames Barrier should keep London safe from floods for 100 years or so. Surely no one will quarrel with that. Kelvin sands on the Murray Firth in northeast Scotland overwhelmed whole villages and farms only 200 years ago. Now they've been stabilised by planting pine forests. I'm back where we started these programmes, on the Stiper Stones in Shropshire. I always thought, when I was growing up here, that this landscape, any landscape for that matter, was permanent, that it didn't basically change. But of course, it does. It's like a living thing, almost. A sensitive and complex mechanism that forever decays, shifts, and renews itself. If we look and listen carefully, though, we can learn to read the landscape and to understand the processes that have shaped it over the thousands of millions of years since the Earth began. We can understand how they still shape it. The landscapes of Britain and Ireland are among the most varied and beautiful of any area of comparable size on the face of the Earth. Let's learn to treat them with respect.
To accompany this series, there's a Channel 4 book entitled Landshapes, written by Dennis Brunsden, Rita Gardner, Andrew Gowdy and David Jones. It's priced at £14.95 and available from most bookshops. And there's also a study guide. It's a useful introduction to landscape and geomorphology. If you'd like a copy of that, you need to send a large stamped addressed envelope to Landshapes, P.O. Box 4000, London W3 6XJ, or Glasgow G12 9JQ.
Capture the atmosphere and the magic of the East.
It's all part of that 60s thing. I love Indian food.
You don't have to fly to India.